So in part one of this series, our lead pastor, Buck, shared that he and Jill had a recent fight about a potato. And then in part two, Jen Mazzola was up and she had a nice long list on the wall that her and Sal have fought about over the last 2 weeks, which is, I think, pretty much everything that you can fight about. Although she said that they don't fight, they fuss. I kind of like that word. Maybe I'll adopt that. And today, I thought I would just try to balance it out because the reality is Emily and I, we don't fight. Except for our most recent fight, which was about a bag of Chex Mix and some Mexican chocolate, NFL football, a rainstorm, and the government. Kind of all came together in this unique combination. Technically, that actually wasn't, our most recent was just last weekend. We misremembered a conversation about whether I had signed up to be available to help around the yard with all the fallen branches. I don't remember ever committing saying I could help. She says I definitely did, so I'm sure I did. That was last weekend. Just 2 weekends before that, though, we were flying back into Houston because we had just celebrated our 7-year wedding anniversary. And we had to go through customs because we were flying in from Mexico. Technically, you have to do that. It feels like you're flying in from Florida or something, though. They ask you one question, right? We went through, and they're like, do you have any food, alcohol, or drugs on you? I thought about, like, oh, it'd be fun to mess with this guy. Then I realized that's not who you do that with. So we're like, nope, we're good. So we walked through, and to set the scene for you a little bit, me being the warm, kind, engaged, supportive husband that I am, especially after a romantic trip we just taken together as our anniversary, I am watching on my phone the NFC Championship game between the 49ers and the Eagles, and I've got one AirPod in as we're going through the airport. Not only that, but I'm just learning, like I'm just catching up with the world, that the second and third string quarterback of the 49ers is hurt, right? They just put in a cheerleader at quarterback, and I'm like, this is crazy. And Houston is not handling a rainstorm well as we're doing this. The airport, the terminal that we're in, there is already a portion of the ceiling that is caved in, and there is water falling on the luggage on the carousel that is going around. Emily goes and she grabs our wet bag off of the luggage. You may ask why I didn't do that. Not because I wasn't willing to help. I just really don't multitask well. They didn't have a quarterback. It was crazy. So watching this, and she grabs the bag off, she looks at me, and you would think she would be about to, ask for some help or, remind me of my air. What she does instead is she's kind of panicked and her eyes are big. And she says, Jordan, the Chex Mix. I'm like, no, Chex Mix can't play quarterback. That's not gonna be helpful here. And she's like, no, the Chex Mix and then the Mexican chocolate bars, they're in your backpack. And I was like, first I laughed, and then I was like, are you hungry? Do you need a snack? She goes, no. We just lied to the customs agents. You have food in your bag. What are we gonna do? And then I was like, wait a minute. You're not being serious, right? Which if you look up empathy under any dictionary, that's not the type of response that you would see in any example. But I said that, and she was like, no, do we have to go tell them? But if we tell them, they'll know we'll lie, and what's gonna happen? And I proceed to try to tell her that that's not what the laws are, created for and what they describe. But what happened for the next 30 minutes is it slowly escalated, kind of with little digs at one another. And so we had what I think you would call a full-blown communication breakdown, right? I was trying to tell her, hey, we're fine. It's Chex Mix is no big deal. She was trying to communicate to me, you're not hearing me. It's not about the Chex Mix. I want to tell you what I think it was really about towards the end of our time, okay? I want to come back to it. But I do want to spend our time in part 3 today talking about communication. Because I don't know how we could do a series called Love Handles, giving tools for relationships, and not just romantic relationships, but really any relationship, and not talk about communication. Because communication ultimately is where the relationship exists. It's where it begins, if you will. It would be normal to respond if somebody said, hey, do you know that person? And you said, no, we've never spoken before, or yes, we've talked a few times. I mean, it's the starting point of the relationship, but it's also where everything is exchanged in the relationship. All of our dreams and desires, all of our stories, all of our emotions and hopes, right? All of that happens in that kind of space. So it's incredibly foundational. This is something that I hope is helpful for you if you feel stuck in patterns of communication, if you just feel maybe exhausted or like you always fight about the same things or with the same person. This is hopefully helpful today if you don't like communication, you don't like sharing, what's going on or what you're feeling. I hope that this is helpful for you if you're kind of tired of the surface level communication, the sports and the weather, and you're looking to connect with people at a different level. Anybody that desires to connect with people, this is kind of where we're going today. But I want to kind of talk about what is it that makes it so difficult? Like, what is it that makes it so challenging? Why is something that is so foundational so hard to get right if it is so core? And I want to start with a little refresher on kind of the power of words. I say refresher just because I don't think this is anything that you guys don't already know. But words are so significant because when you think about what communication really is, it's an exchange of audiovisual cues, right? Like our facial expressions, it's our body language, and then it is noises that come out of our mouth at certain tones and pitches, and it's organized in such a way that the person hears it on the other side of us in the way that they gain something from it. They respond to it. It can incite tears of laughter and joy, and your words can incite tears of pain and heartache. Words can start wars, and words can end wars. People can gain something from your words that literally their heart, their mind, their soul, their brain, your words. And I would imagine that for many of us, we are still hurting from words that we heard in our childhood or perhaps words that we didn't actually hear in our childhood. They're significant. So what goes into making communication so complicated then? Why is it so difficult to use those words? I think part of the reason that communication is difficult is just practical. For example, you have about 10,000 facial expressions that you are capable of making. That's a lot of nuance. Maybe you've had a friend before where you've had to figure out, it took you a while to be like, I don't know if you're angry or if that's just your thinking face or if you have gas. Like, I know it's all kind of the same, there's like confusion, complication there. Not only is there nuance in what we see in all of our body language, but then multiple people can hear the same thing, same conversation, and have entirely different takeaways. Sometimes we miss entire words, entire statements, we mishear, we take away a different meaning. In fact, when I told somebody on our message prep team what part 3 was going to be about this week, they sent me a TikTok that has been going around that is a really interesting example of this. It's kind of an annoying sound. I'll just play it through 2 times. But there's a list of words on there that could be what you potentially hear. And I'm curious what it is that you hear. Just kind of read down the list as it plays.
That is embarrassing. 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 That is embarrassing.
Anybody in the that is embarrassing crowd? Is that, okay, a few hands. That one jumped out to me the most. I don't know why, I could hear a lot of them. Apparently, you hear a different line in there because of your past experiences and your personal wiring. So your brain, because it's not clear, like picks one of those out for you to hear, and it happens entirely subconsciously. Which means that if you're in here and you heard lactates in pharmacy, I'd love to chat after. I don't know, I just curious what led to that. But it's complicated, right? There's a lot of different things we can hear. And just as crazy, you can pre-decide what it is that you want to hear. You can make a decision ahead of time, and that can be used as a weapon. Absolutely, that can be weaponized, or it can be a really helpful tool because it means it is something that we can work on. almost any song that has misheard lyrics, you can kind of make that point. For example, there is a song called Second Chance by Shinedown. It's an older song. And in it, towards the chorus, there's this line where he says, I just saw Halley's Comet, Julie. He's talking about his wife. His wife's name is Julie. So just, he's kind of sharing this moment with her. And it's kind of drawn out, but you can hear it. I just saw Halley's Comet. He says, Julie. So I want to play the clip for you so you can hear it.
I just saw Halley's Comet, Julie.
Okay, everybody hear Julie? So I lied to you. That's not what he actually says. I don't know what his wife's name is, but it's a commonly misheard lyric. The actual lyric, what they actually said in the song is, she waved, also kind of drawn out, she waved. But listen to it here, same exact clip.
I just saw Halley's Comet, Julie.
Did it switch for anybody? Could you hear both? Yeah? Some of you, some not, some people struggling with it. Those two things sound nothing alike, right? Julie and she waved have nothing in common. And yet, if you pre-decide, some of you are able to switch, like even in just the very moment. There is a lot that is complicated about communication. And we haven't even talked about yet any kind of cultural differences, human limitations, any kind of changing language. I mean, culturally, even within the same country, sometimes your family had like some kind of isms that you didn't realize nobody else used that kind of language. I remember more on the extreme, one of our early trips to Juja, Kenya with Mosaic, our global engagement ministry. I went with that team that year, and there were 17 of us, and one day we took a field trip to a different orphanage, so not the one that we partner with every year, but we wanted to go learn from a larger one. They had about 100 orphans. It's just an incredible organization, and we went on stage to introduce ourselves, and we do what you do when you're from Austin, Texas. We said, hey, we're from Austin, and we all put up a hook 'em horns. Although a hook 'em horns in Kenya is not a hook 'em horns. It's not an I love you either. It is a devil horns, basically like wishing evil on you. All of the kids laughed, screamed, pointed. The older ones are covering their eyes. I kid you not. It would be kind of like we just showed up and we're like, hey, kids, and we just flipped everybody off in the room. So embarrassing, super ignorant of us, right? But I mean, there are so many different things like that in play. Our human limitations, I don't know if you've ever heard the acronym HALT, BS, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, bored, and then sad or stressed. If you are in any of those states, if you need a Snickers bar, you're not in the best posture to have like a deep connective conversation. And then language is changing all the time. I hung out this weekend with Matt, who's just up here, our student director at W3, our middle school environment. I kid you not, half the time, I don't know if those middle schoolers are complimenting me or insulting me. I just like smile and wave, and they're like, think something's wrong with me, I don't know. You can't even use their language back to them, because then it's super weird and awkward. There's all these rules. There's so much to it. And you put all of that together, and at least we should have some grace for ourselves, understanding that communication is very difficult. Of course, we don't get it right all the time. All of that in one package, though, still, I don't think we've actually talked about the foundational issue that actually makes communication so difficult. To figure out what that is specifically, and I'll try to unpack that, I want to go to the scriptures, because that is a collection of literature that is still impacting us, in some cases, 4,000 years later. Meaning these are, objectively, some of the best communicators that have ever lived, that they still today can impact us, that we would change our lives and make decisions off of it is what they wrote. And one of the best, one of the true like masters of literature is Solomon, who wrote a lot of Proverbs. It's a collection of wise sayings, and it has a lot to say about how we use our words and how we connect and how we listen. Here's just a couple examples of those. In Proverbs 15, he says, a gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. You know this. When there's a moment, it's kind of the beginning, the tension point of the argument, perhaps, you have the opportunity to respond with kindness, compassion. You can pause, you can listen, you can ask more questions, or you can power up. You can get defensive. You can shut down. You can tell them why they're crazy, right? You can avoid it altogether. We have options, and you don't need me to tell you, which path is which, right? One is obviously very restorative and fights for a relationship, and one shuts the relationship down. In 18, he says something kind of similar. He says that the tongue can bring death or life. Those who love to talk will reap the consequences. I don't even really think that's an exaggeration. I mean, our words can breathe life or death into, a career, in an interview, a job opportunity, into a first date based on the words that we use, into any of our meaningful relationships. Our words hold that kind of weight and capacity. I think very simply, we could go chapter by chapter through Proverbs, but I think if you were to summarize what maybe even the whole Bible has to say about how we use our words and communicate, but especially Proverbs in particular, what it has to say about our words, the summary would be talk less and be kind. Be quicker to listen. And be kind, meaning not polite. That's not a nice thing. It's about power under control. It's about leveraging you and your ability for the person on the other side of you. You probably didn't need me to tell you that, right? You came in here today knowing, that's the ideal. I don't know that anybody that would necessarily disagree with that. And at the same time, we miss this mark all the time. It's so simple. Why is it that we can't do it? Why do we respond? Why do we get defensive? Why do we shut down? Why do we power up? Why do we run away? Why is it that some of us, if we're being honest, we have used words with the most important people in our life that if anybody else were to ever talk to them that way, we would want to fight those people. And yet we've used those words and directed them at the people that we love most. What is that? Where is that coming from? Because I think that is what makes communication and connection so challenging. To answer it, I want to go to the greatest communicator that has ever lived. This is more of just historical fact because nobody's words have impacted human history more than the words of Jesus. Every culture on the planet, people reorganizing their lives around his words, whether they know it consciously or not. And his words have just as much impact today. I want to look at what he says about words because he has a metaphor where he talks about the source of them and where they come from. In this kind of famous Sermon on the Plain in Luke chapter 6, it mirrors the very famous Sermon on the Mount. And he introduces us to this metaphor. He says, a good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. A tree is identified by its fruit. Figs are never gathered from thorn bushes, and grapes are not picked from bramble bushes. Jesus does, in his very brilliant Jesus way, he brings the educated and the uneducated together, the religious, non-religious together, and he uses a metaphor that everybody there can understand to make a very simple but also very profound point. In a very legalistic culture, where all the outward behavior and actions and dress and all that mattered, he brings it immediately to the heart and says what's happening out here reveals what's really going on inside. To make sure we're kind of grasping this point real quick, because it's going to be important going forward, I'm going to put a series of trees here on the screen, and if you would just call out what kind of tree it is, unless you're a treeologist or something. Does that exist? I don't know. Not a scientific name, just what your 5-year-old would say, okay? So here's the principle played out. This is a apple tree. Thank you. The second one is a lemon tree. We had one orange up front last service, so you guys, I felt more 100% lemon on that. Okay, lemon tree. Here's one more example. What's this? Yeah, a money tree, a dollar tree, which I put that one up there to say it's such a simple principle that you can even apply it to something that doesn't exist because your brain grasps it so quickly, right? So he's driving home this point that what is seen externally, it's really driven by what's on the inside of you. And then he takes that metaphor and he applies it to the person. And he says a good person produces good fruit from the things, or from the treasury of a good heart, and an evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. Which, first glance, you might read that and be like, okay, so does that mean I'm a good person? Am I an evil person? I would probably say some of both of those things. I actually don't think that's what Jesus is trying to drive home here. This isn't a point where he's presenting the gospel, if you will, because the Bible's answer is a little bit more nuanced on that question. On one hand, all of us are evil people. Nobody is good. We've all missed the mark. We're all separate from God in the state of our sin. And at the same time, if you've placed your trust in Christ for your forgiveness, there's a reconciliation that happens where you are good with God, not based on anything you've done, but based on what Jesus has already done for you. But that's not what he's illustrating here. We know this from the metaphor that preceded right before, and also kind of his closing statement, the point he makes right after this. He's really trying to drive this principle of, hey, I know there's all this noise and all this behavior, but hey, what I really care about is what's going on in here. Because at the end of the verse, he says, what you say flows from what is in your heart. sometimes we need to look closely and draw a principle out of a story or give a lot of historical context or something. And then other times, the bottom line, the main point of the day is just so black and white. And this is the point of what I'm trying to drive home in part 3 here today, that what you say ultimately flows from what is in your heart, that at some point it will boil up and it will come out on those around us, no matter who is around us. And it ends up being the people that we care about the most because they tend to spend the most time with us, and we can only pretend or present for so long before the heart ultimately shows itself. And so those people are the ones that are on the other side of our heart coming out. Not only that, but part of the reason that being disconnected from somebody that you care about is so painful is because it's not just a miscommunication of information. It's not just a logical, intellectual thing. It is two hearts missing each other. And there is little more isolating, lonely, little more painful than two hearts that care deeply for one another, disconnected and missing each other. And so what I'd like to do with the second half of our time is I'd like to try to give kind of a framework to be like, okay, that's foundational. Now, how does that impact, my car ride going home today or my next conflict on Wednesday? Like, what do I actually do with that? That's the principle that's going to drive the rest of our conversation. And I came across this kind of foundational tool a couple of years ago. My wife, Emily, she's a counselor in the Austin area, and her organization, in order to equip her to lead marriage retreats, marriage intensives, wanted to send her on one to experience what they're like first on the other side. And so these marriage intensives, they are like 4 nights, 3 or 4 couples, a couple counselors. It's like 50 hours of counseling. Some of you are like, that'd be amazing. Others of you could think of little less you'd like to do with your life. But these are what we went on. I'm the only husband Emily has, so I got to go along for the journey. And we went to Atlanta, right outside of Atlanta, to Chick-fil-A's retreat center. So it was beautiful. It was so nice, and it was a really just powerful, impactful couple days for us. But one of the days, we spent kind of unpacking this kind of principle, and the specific tool that was laid out for us was called the conflict cycle. Perhaps you've heard of this before. I think this is not just like another kind of self-help tool, if you will. I think this is like taking these foundational principles that we know God designed us for community. We know he designed us for relationship and to connect with one another. When that breaks, what's happening? When the heart gets involved, what's going on there? And this is such a cool kind of tool or model of it. It's in the form of an infinity loop because when you're in conflict, you can stay in it indefinitely. You've probably experienced before fighting for hours on end, late into the night. And you just said the same thing back and forth to each other over and over and over and over again. What is that? You are in the loop, back and forth. It can be not just a night, too. You can stay that in kind of the long term. Every time this gets brought up, every time we re-engage, we jump into the same cycle. We're triggered by the same stuff, right? So that's why it's in that kind of shape. And I think it's so important because if Jesus is saying, hey, what's in our heart is going to come out, well, where is that point? Where is that moment where it kind of like shows its head? So here's the kind of loop, and it starts with a trigger. We'll just call it's a moment, it's an event, it's a song, it's a conversation, it's a tone, it's a look somebody uses, right? Any number of things that kind of like incite the cycle, like it's beginning, there's opportunity for the conflict to start. Then from that trigger, from that moment, we take away a meaning. There's something that kind of set off in us that has this very core message, this very core kind of relational need of, a fear or a desire. Maybe I'm not safe in this conversation anymore. I'm questioning, am I enough? I'm triggering, am I going to be alone? Are you going to take advantage of me? Like something has come up from the way this event happened, and you experience simultaneously, technically almost first, you experience an emotion with that. You're angry. You are afraid. You are disgusted. Something comes up that causes you to want to protect yourself. You that want to go in a self-preservation mode. And as soon as you do that, as soon as we get defensive, or as soon as we run, or as soon as we shut down, well, that triggers that same thing in the person on the other side of us. The disconnection has happened, and now this side would represent the person on the other side of you. Now the loop is beginning, and now we can go for hours and hours or days on end, right? This is how it kind of begins. I want to give you a couple of stories personally to see, okay, how would you actually use that? We're not going to get out a diagram and then, hold on, we're fighting. Can you just draw that real quick? So I want to show what did that look like for Emily and I personally. I'll use us as an example. one of the things that we discovered, certainly over the course of this weekend, I'm speeding up a lot of time here, but my kind of core message when Emily and I are in conflict with one another, there's a couple, but the main one I'm usually going to is, am I enough? And that is specific to me. That would be the question for some of you in here. It wouldn't be the question for all of you. Where those kind of meaning or messages form, though, for all of us is in our childhood. It's young. For me, my dad traveled almost every week, Monday through Friday, but he was my coach in every single sport I played. So I lived for the moments when car rides home after a game that he was praising what a great game I played, and I dreaded the moments when he was critical of what a horrible game I had. And I started to take away this messaging of when I'm successful, things are safe, things are stable, my family is happy. When I fail, it causes chaos in my family, right? So there was a deep kind of fear of failure, definitely early on. And then when I was 15, that kind of got hammered home when my parents separated. And my message then, fair or unfair, it's just how my teenage brain kind of processed it, is if somebody that loves me doesn't want to live in the same house with me, I mean, surely there's something wrong with me. Am I enough? So when I start to bring up that question, I mean, it goes deep for me because I'm like, man, if I'm not enough, people may leave me. That's part of my core. Now, Emily had a very different childhood. Hers was a much more unstable childhood. Lots of loss, lots of an extended and her immediate family. Her mom passed away when Emily was 10 years old from cancer. And then her dad passed away when she was 21. Her dad never really recovered from the loss of her mom. Emily basically raised herself throughout middle school and high school. So Emily's core question is not, am I enough? Emily's core question is, am I safe? That's the core thing whenever we're starting to bump and get in a conflict that's coming up for her. So let me show you with a very simple example, kind of the, potatoes, Chex Mix type things. Something simple before we, think about any heavy examples to show you just how a normal conversation this could come up. I always think about, this was a couple years into marriage. Emily had decided to go back to grad school in order to be a counselor. And we had pre-decided that I was going to take on a lot more responsibilities around the house, help with a lot of things, because she was going to be working and interning and going to grad school, and she had a lot more on her plate. Well, we've done this weekly meeting thing for a long time. It's not a date. It's like a specific time of the week where we kind of talk about some of the most important parts of our relationship and schedule and what's coming up and all this. And we always end it by asking the question that Jim Yedelin actually introduced a few weeks ago, the question of what was it like on the other side of me this week? So about 2 weeks into grad school, I asked that question at the end of our time. And I think part of the reason this memory is so ingrained in my mind is because Emily was so kind in her response that it caused me to pause and kind of panic at my own response. I was like, what just happened there? What came out of my heart, if you will? What was that? So she says, hey, this week, I'm really grateful. I saw, you mowed the lawn, you did the trash, you vacuumed. It really means a lot. I can tell that you're making an effort. And probably the only thing I have is if you look, the dishes are a little bit of a science project right now. They're kind of growing. And so if you just next week, that would be super helpful. But otherwise, it's a great week. I respond with, that's not true. I don't even know what I was saying wasn't true. I just respond, that's not true. I repeated the list that she had just said to me and thanked me for. I mowed this week, and I trimmed around the trees like you asked me to, and I even vacuumed under the couches and got all of Mowgli's dog hair this week. I took the trash out before the trash came this week, which is kind of the goal, the ideal of that. And I definitely did the dishes after dinner on Tuesday, so I know that it wasn't a week full of dishes. And she just looks at me, kind of shut down, what? Did you hear what I just said? Where did you just go? And I could tell, I crushed her. What was happening in that moment is something about her giving that feedback to me and my own insecurity. I took away the message of, I'm not enough. I failed. I had a job. I had a commitment I made. I didn't do my job this week. I'm a bad husband. I'm going in this shame spiral just by her asking about the dishes. Now, when I respond like that about the dishes, right, in the sink, how safe do you think that makes Emily feel? I can't even bring up a couple of plates in the sink to him. Oh my gosh, how safe is that gonna feel to her? And our loop, our conflict cycle starts to go. What happened, and this is, I don't know if you guys love this stuff like I do, but just hang with me if you're But for me, I love the science behind this stuff too, because it's this is how God designed us. We know he designed us to connect with one another. We know how important relationship is. And you can see it even in the way we respond, what's happening to us. Your brain when you get defensive. Like when I got defensive and I said, that's not true, my brain, my prefrontal cortex went offline. If you've ever heard the term flipping your lid, if you heard somebody say that before, that's what happened. And my rational, logical brain is offline. My limbic system over here has taken over, or you could say my heart. Jesus promised what is in here is going to come out. And this was coming out. And I have this deep-rooted insecurity of, am I enough, that I haven't dealt with, I haven't addressed. And now it's surfacing, right? And in that moment, based on kind of like what your coping skills were, you're going to go to one of the fight or flight modes, or there's also freeze, which is, kind of like just the immobilizing, like I'm not going to say anything, or fawn, which is a kind of unique, like, people-pleasing, a little manipulative, even like flirtatious vibes sometimes to say, like, I can kind of get what I want if I engage people this way. These are so helpful. Like, it's God-given. It is good when you are under a real threat. If you actually needed to defend yourself from something, if there is a bear and that's the threat, and you need to freeze and say, I'm not a threat, that is good that your mind kind of instinctually goes there. It is also helpful when you are in actual unsafe places in your home, meaning not just they have an attitude, but like I'm in an abusive space, my home is not safe. This helps you cope and survive. There are good attributes of this. When it's not helpful is when the person that you're trying to connect with is somebody that you love, when it's your spouse, when it's one of your children. And now you're powering up and fighting or shaming, or now you're fleeing and you're like, I'm just going to avoid home. I'm going to avoid these conversations altogether. I'm just going to shut down. I'm going to be a wall. I'm not going to let anybody see kind of what's happening inside of you. None of these are helpful when you're trying to connect with the people that matter most. That's why getting to the root of those core fears and desires, this is actually a little bit connected to part one when we talked about the soul work and how's your soul. To understand what is in here, we've all got a couple that are driving us. To be able to name those is the starting point. To identify what's in the heart, to guard the heart like the scriptures talk about, that is the kind of starting point of understanding or breaking this kind of infinite cycle loop. Because you're not really afraid of spiders. You're not really afraid of heights. There's a core fear underneath those when you get to the most foundational one. You're not really afraid of running out of money. A lot of us fear that, but for entirely different reasons. Some of us, it is a safety thing, similar to Emily, that if we didn't have it, things would be unsafe. For others of us, it's connected to our identity. Would I be enough? Would people think less of me? Would I ultimately be alone? There's a core fear that drives all of these different things. So once you've identified that, some of the ones we just kind of named for Emily and I, it gives you the opportunity to break the cycle. And we have a word for that when you share what is in your heart. And that word is being vulnerable, to be able to speak to it and name it. Let me go back to Emily a few days later, and kind of a version of this would look a lot more like, hey, I said I was going to do that and I didn't. You're right. I'm sorry. Like I committed to that. I missed it this week. And you didn't say anything wrong in that. What was coming up for me was totally on me, not on you. And now I get the opportunity to go to a vulnerable place and say, like, when that came up, I just feel like I failed you. I just felt like I was a terrible husband. I know that's not what you said. I just felt like a terrible husband, and that's on me. That's not on you. And I would imagine that with all you're carrying, that for only the second week to me to already miss one of those things, that might not feel that safe. What if this continues? What if I just keep being less intentional? That probably doesn't feel that safe, and it definitely doesn't feel safe when I respond like it did. I'm sorry. I apologize. I love you. That kind of moment breaks the cycle and re-engages a new kind of cycle, a new kind of restorative place in the relationship. Now, that's just with dishes, right? Those are the kind of Chex Mix things. Like I would imagine, hey, lying, to a customs agent feels not that safe. I could see how she's a couple steps away from we're going to prison for the rest of our lives. And I don't have to fix for her in that moment that nobody has ever gone to prison for smuggling Chex Mix into the country, but I can just kind of sit and get, hey, I get that that's scary. I can sit in that moment without having to fix it once we've identified what some of those things are. I think this is so beautifully illustrated. They showed us this visual at this retreat by this art sculpture called Our Inner Child, and it's this idea of two adults in conflict, disconnected from one another, but there's this part of us that ultimately so desires to connect with the person on the other side of me. As I'm trying to tell myself I'm enough, I'm telling myself, I'm not trying to prove it to Emily, I'm trying to prove it to myself. There's this part of me that just so desperately wants to be enough for her and connect with her. And this can apply to so many of our relationships, and I think what's so beautiful is God sees the whole person of you. He knows you intimately. He wants to meet you at and heal those parts of you, heal those fears, and meet those desires that are inside of you. He wants to be intimately involved in this process. I think the big idea is kind of if you do want to connect at a heart level, we have to start developing the tools of what it looks like to communicate at that level, right? If we want to connect that way, are we speaking to, are we noticing that level, both in us and in the people on the other side of us? A couple simple steps might just look like this. I think the first step is really trying to do the work to identify what's happening in your heart. If Jesus promises it's going to come out, then we should do some work sitting with, well, what is in there? How can I address it? What needs healing in there? Like, we would want to be aware of it if it's definitely going to come out of us. And for some of us, like, that might be taking a time out in a moment to maybe identify what's happening, might be journaling or writing it down. I think most of us are going to need help to figure out what that is. Whether that's a group leader or a trusted friend or a mentor or a counselor, somebody is going to have to help us kind of identify what's going on in there. Once we can name it, it gives us the ability to sit with and kind of listen to what's happening in their heart, in the person on the other side of the loop. And now I'm listening for not just the potato or not just the Chex Mix, but I'm trying to say, what are they really saying underneath that? I think about 3 days after we got home from this retreat, you would think we would have at least had like a month-long no-fight pass or something, like, oh, we're fixed. We did 5 days of counseling. But we got home, we had our first opportunity to engage all this, and we just totally botched it. Because there was, if you were living in Austin a couple of years ago, you'd remember this. There was that massive hailstorm. Like, if you weren't here, just picture like small children of ice, like falling out of the sky. It was unbelievable. I mean, I grew up on Lake Erie in Cleveland, and we had crazy storms off the lake. I'd never seen anything like this. And Shane Norcross, who's our connection director, his window was right by my car, my Honda Civic. He filmed it, and then he sent it to me, and he said, I just want you to see your car depreciating in real time. Super encouraging. That's great. So anyways, we get on the phone with the insurance agent, and because basically it's like a year backup, everybody in Central Texas needs their car fixed, they're just sending people checks, and they're like, you can deal with that at a later time. Well, I asked the guy, I was like, do I have to fix the car? Because that's a big check. And he said, no, you could actually go to Vegas this weekend if you want. Just please take me with you if you do. I'm like, I like this guy. So I went to Emily, and I was like, I want to drive this car until it's worth $100 anyways. It feels like a bad investment. It runs just fine. It's just the way it looks on the outside. I don't think we should fix the hail damage. Well, Emily is more of a normal human, and so, it was like, they give you a check to fix the car, like, fix the car. And I could tell that it had a lot of energy for her in a way that made me really curious, because I know her well enough to know she's not vain. She's not like, man, you're just going to look so great driving into Northpoint in your dentless Honda Civic. Like, I know that's not what is on her mind, so I'm like, where is this energy? Like, why does she passionately want us to fix the car? Well, when you go back to the loop, back to our cycle, when things weren't taken care of, when things weren't kept up with in Emily's childhood, physical health, when things weren't taken care of in the home, their really valuable possessions, there was the most dire consequences for her. I'm over here like, hey, trust me. Let me be enough. I'm going to invest this. We're going to turn this into so much more. This is going to be fantastic. Like, I'm all excited about all these different opportunities. And we're totally having two completely different conversations. But the second we could name it, we did get the book back out and we looked at it, and the second we could name it, there was this moment of connection. And actually this really wild moment to be like, when I get vulnerable to say, I'm concerned that I'm not enough, like, well, that's the fear that's coming up for me, it actually complements her desire so well. If she knows that I want to engage, I want to be intentional, I want to help, that feels safe to her. And similarly, if she's like, I want to feel safe, I want you engaged, she's like inviting me in. And that feels empowering. That feels like, man, you see me as enough. It's such a connective process when one of us can try to break the cycle. But I think, as helpful as that might be, especially if you're new to church, if you're questioning, like, trying to figure out who you think Jesus is, as helpful as those first two could be, I really think this third one is what makes it all come together, and that is ultimately inviting God into the process. Even on the front end, trying to figure out what is in my heart. He knows your heart, to ask him to search and help discover and name those things. But also, I think it's equally important that I would say, or not communicate at any point, that it's Emily's responsibility to make me feel enough, or my responsibility to keep Emily safe at all times. Like, we can't provide that for each other. That's not the point of this exercise. It's only God that can meet those fears and meet those desires in us and heal what needs to be healed and trust him in the times when we're questioning and concerned. And when we've gone to him first, when we've received something from him that we didn't have before, it allows us to sit in those moments. Me working on feeling like I'm not enough, that's a whole different message in a whole different context, but that's a God-centric piece of work that I have to go through in myself to see where is my identity, right? And inviting him into the process will allow me to sit in some of those conversations and restore and kind of make those connections. So we've put a love handle forward in each part of the series so far. We're going to do that in each one. And the love handle for this one today is communicate to connect. Not communicate to be right, not communicate to win, not communicate to get your point across. What if the goal of communication was ultimately connection? And you know there's two people that do desire to connect with one another. And what if that causes us to pause and think differently about how it is that we communicate? What if the question, we've kind of put a question forward in each part as well, was if you ask yourself, how can I communicate with curiosity and compassion? Like how Solomon challenges us to approach these conversations. That would be curious about what is in our heart and what's in the heart of the person on the other side of us that we care so much about. If we were to start there with an openness about what's inside of me and what's in the inside of the people that we care about so much, perhaps God can get involved in that process and break some cycles that we've been running back to and exhausted by and overwhelmed by for a long time. That's my hope. That's my dream. That's my desire for this part. And I'm so grateful that God is so personally involved in each one of those scenarios. Would you guys pray with me? Father, thank you that you know our hearts better than we know ourselves. God, thank you that you're not leaving us alone in all this, but that you meet us here, you have grace and compassion with us, and just really ask for the strength to take a step because this is vulnerable. This is scary. This is the stuff that can be overwhelming. God, I ask you to turn down our inner lawyer if we think this doesn't matter, because it so does. But God, you're with us, and you know our hearts, and I ask that you heal what needs to be healed and give us eyes to see what we can't see right now and help us to connect with those so important people in our lives. Father, we love you. We need you, and it's in Jesus' name that we pray these things. Amen. Thank you guys for being here, hanging this week. We'll see you for part 4 next Sunday.